All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to get started here. My name is Bradley Peterson. I work for the firm of Flaherty and Hood here in St. Paul, and we do all of the lobbying and organizational management for the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities, and I act as their executive director. The Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities is an organization of over 100 cities outside of the 7-county metro area, working together on items such as local government aid and property taxes, economic development, transportation, environmental issues, annexation and land use, all things of common interest to our member cities in rural Minnesota. Two key players in that work are with us today, and I'm going to take a moment here to introduce Greg Zilka, who is the mayor of Little Falls and also serves as the president of the CGMC this year. And then also we have on the line Craig Clark, who is the city administrator in Austin, Minnesota, and has been a board member of ours for many, many years. So we're going to spend a couple of minutes here outlining some of our key priorities for the legislative session, and then we're happy to take questions. If you do have a question, please indicate your name and outlet in the chat, and then Kelly, who is assisting us, will unmute you and call on you to ask your question, and then we'll do our level best to respond. So that's how that'll all work. So, you know, as the state continues to grapple with the COVID-19 pandemic, and as lawmakers begin to craft the next 2-year state budget, the CGMC is calling on Governor Walz and the legislature to focus on key priorities that will help set the stage for economic recovery. Issues such as local government aid, childcare, housing, and water infrastructure have long been among our priorities, but the pandemic has made them even more critical and timely. Since March, cities have been on the front lines of pandemic response. Many cities have taken proactive steps to help their residents and businesses by waiving fees, deferring property tax collections, altering land use restrictions to accommodate socially distanced dining and other activities, distributing the federal coronavirus aid to business and families in need, all things in response to the pandemic. On top of these extra measures, cities have still needed to provide essential services such as police and fire protection, street maintenance, drinking water, wastewater, and parks and trails, all of the things that make for strong communities across the state. As cities continue to deal with the uncertainty of the pandemic, we want to emphasize that reliable local government aid funding from the state is more important than ever. The absolute single most important thing that the state can do to support our communities this year is to ensure that local government aid is paid on time and in full. And so we were very pleased earlier this week when Governor Walz came out with his budget that did not include any cuts or changes to the local government aid program. But with the state facing a potential $1.3 billion deficit in the next biennium, and not knowing how the next 4 months of the legislative session will play out, we are not taking any chances at all. And so at every opportunity, we are going to be talking about the importance of LGA and the role that it plays in supporting our communities in the pandemic and into the recovery. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Mayor Zilka to talk a little bit about LGA from the perspective of the city of Little Falls. Mayor?
Good morning. As Bradley mentioned, I'm Greg Zilka, the mayor of Little Falls and the president of the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities. Let me start by saying that this pandemic has taken a toll on our community. Some state segments are still struggling, and that pain has ripple effects across our city. Our small businesses continue with that struggle, even though our Economic Development Authority has given them grants. We've done advertising in our paper and on the radio and done everything that we can to try to help them get through this. As mayor, it's heartbreaking because you want to be there for everybody. In Little Falls, we're trying to help our residents and businesses make it through this pandemic by providing the services that they rely on, like police and fire, streets, libraries, parks, water. In my city, LGA makes up about 40% of our general fund. So any cut to the LGA program would be devastating. What would we do? What would we cut? If the state were to cut the LGA, the only way to remedy that without cutting services to our police and fire is to tax the heck out of our communities. Our residents and businesses are hurting enough right now. Cutting LGA would be a huge setback in an already difficult time. Bradley, back to you.
Sure. One other thing that I'll note about local government aid is, the mayor mentioned that it's 40% of his general fund budget in Little Falls. For the state, it's about 2.2%. And so in that way, a little bit from the state goes a very, very long way in our communities. In addition to LGA, we are also calling on the legislature to invest in two issue areas that are major barriers to economic growth in Greater Minnesota: childcare and housing. Let me be clear, the economic recovery cannot happen unless Greater Minnesota's workforce has a place to live and someone to look after their children while they work. According to First Children's Finance, Greater Minnesota has a shortage of 39,000 childcare slots as of last summer. While more recent numbers are not yet available, the need is expected to grow even more as parents return to the workforce. I'm going to turn it over to Craig Clark in Austin to talk a little bit more about childcare from the perspective of the City of Austin.
Thank you, Bradley. My name is Craig Clark, City Administrator for Austin. Childcare is a critical issue in our community and a major concern. That Children's First Finance statistics for Austin specifically in our broader area had 1,615 spots and 810 for Austin specifically. This COVID situation we're dealing with has really hampered our ability for our child care providers to provide this critical service. Obviously, they don't operate on a high profit margin, and these changes have dramatically impacted them. While we've had some state grants come through, those have been small in the range of $1,000 to $450. So that's just really kept them afloat rather than helped them out in any significant way. We're still predominantly an in-home care provider situation. We'd like to see some movement towards more child care centers to provide more economies of scale to address this issue. And we really feel strongly that in order for our economy to pick back up that's been ravaged by this pandemic, we really need to help have child care be addressed so that we can have reliable child care for our workers and our youngest residents in our community. We really know firsthand that when we see our third grade proficiency at 45% and our graduation rate at 71%, lower than the state average, those are the things when childcare years later come to a realization, and we want to try to address that. So we both address the immediate term for childcare as well as long term. And I'll turn it back over to Bradley to discuss our proposals in more depth.
So in addition to supporting the distribution of grants to support providers during the pandemic from the state and the federal government, we're also working on a number of proposals to help increase the supply of childcare providers in the marketplace. One of the things that we're working on is a $20 million grant program for funding for construction and expansion of childcare facilities in Greater Minnesota. This is something that was actually created in the bonding bill last year, but it was not funded. And so we're calling on the legislature this year to fill up that bucket so that we can have just the physical facilities in which to provide childcare services. Another item that we're working on is additional funding for DEED's childcare grant program, as well as childcare initiatives facilitated through the 6 initiative foundations that serve Greater Minnesota. These programs provide training, business support, and other resources to help retain existing providers and recruit new ones. And I'm going to turn it back to Craig to talk a little bit about the housing needs in his community and in rural Minnesota.
Great, thanks, Bradley. Yeah, just like childcare, housing is a major concern for our city and has been for several years. Just to give you all a sense of kind of the scope in Austin, in 2020, we saw only 7 single-family homes being constructed. When you look at the need that we have to replace our existing housing stock, we'd really need that number to be more like 90 homes a year. With aging housing stock, replacing those and protecting our tax base is critically important. There's a real disconnect between the need for market rate housing in Greater Minnesota versus what they're facing in the metro area. We need solutions that help us with that market rate demand so that that frees up affordable units for our community. Austin's median home value is about $103,000. And with that, we really have a hard time having developers find an interest in building in Austin and other rural communities. So we need some help on that market rate end of things. The city has advanced housing tax abatement program in concert with the school district and county and city coming together to abate taxes for 5 years. So we've put forward measures that we can at the local level, but we really need a partnership with the state to try to address this in a more systematic way. And we'd like to see more done. I know Mayor Zilka deals with some of those same challenges, and I'll turn it over to him at this point.
Thanks, Greg. You are correct, Craig. Even though we're smaller than Austin, we have similar problems here in Little Falls with childcare and housing. Our childcare situation right now in Little Falls, 56345 area, we have 250 slots needed. Outside of Little Falls, just in the immediate surrounding areas, that goes up over 600. So those needs are here. We've consistently been working on housing projects similar to what you've discussed. And it is hard to get builders in here because of we need the workforce housing, and it's hard to justify building that and still for that to be profitable for the contractors. As we try to build back our economy and recruit new employers to our city, they want to be sure there's some place for their workers to live and affordable daycare for their children. Bradley, I'm going to talk about some housing proposals of the coalition.
Sure. To address some of the housing challenges that the mayor and Craig talked about, we've got a couple of initiatives that we are working on. One is the creation of a new grant program to help cities rehabilitate dilapidated homes. That would be a new program that we're looking to create and fund. We're also looking at funding for the infrastructure, the public infrastructure that supports housing development. So things like streets and sewer and water and the like that also add cost to these developments. That's something that we think could be a successful program. And then additional funding for existing workforce development grant programs, and then some policy changes to help make those programs work a little bit better for Greater Minnesota. They don't quite work quite the way they should, and so we've got some ideas along that line as well. The last issue area that we want to spend a little bit of time talking about is water infrastructure. And so you might be wondering why, when we were successful in passing a significant bonding bill in October that included roughly $270 million for water infrastructure, that we are again calling on the legislature to do more in this issue area. Well, it is because that, as the state has projected, there is $11 billion worth of need over the next 20 years to fund drinking water and wastewater infrastructure projects statewide. So with interest rates still hovering near all-time lows, the CGMC is urging the legislature to pass a bonding bill with at least $100 million for clean water infrastructure grant and loan programs administered by the Public Facilities Authority. Now, some legislators have balked at the idea of passing another bonding bill, but the truth is that their need is so great that the state can't afford to not fund more projects this year. And again, as you've probably picked up, both of these communities have had issues with water and wastewater. And I'm going to turn it to Craig to talk a little bit about the situation in the city of Austin. So Craig?
Yeah, thank you, Bradley. I think our situation really kind of demonstrates things. Our community is a little larger than some other ones, but same issue transpires in Austin as it does in other communities. We were fortunate enough to have some money in the recent bonding bill for design and engineering of our plant to address our aging infrastructure that dates from the 1920s and 30s. We're asking for an additional $13 million to help with a project that's estimated at $78 million. That's the largest capital expenditure for the city and a major item for us to contend with. We've not left our residents unscathed in this. We know we have to have an active part in that. In 2018, we increased our wastewater rates by 25%, and every year until 2023, we'll increase that by another 7% each year for a combined 75% increase over those years. So that's a major component for our ratepayers, whether it's the levy or the wastewater rates. It all comes out of the same pocketbook, and we're cognizant of that as we deal with our constituents as well as our businesses in the community. We won't shy away from the costs, but as you can imagine, with the pandemic that we're facing, these costs become that much more, I guess, highlighted when we deal with the cost of running local government. Mayor Zilka, I know, has similar challenges in Little Falls, and I'll turn it back to him to provide more insight for you.
Thank you, Craig. Small cities simply can't afford to do these projects without help from the state. At Little Falls, we are in the midst of a $25 million project to build a new wastewater facility, which is funded in part through $8 million in grants that were included in the 2018 bonding bill. This funding is vital for us. If we had not received state funding, we would have had to raise rates nearly 250%, 250% to pay for the project. We have fewer residents and we don't have the ability to pool our resources with other communities like they can in the metro. Clean water is a necessity and it benefits the entire state. So it is imperative that the state help cover some of these costs. Bradley, back to you.
All right. Well, as you can see, there are a number of critical items that are facing Greater Minnesota, both in the pandemic and as we look to the future and creating a solid base for the recovery, which is why we're here talking to you today and urging the state to pay local government aid on time and in full, and then make strategic investments in issues such as childcare, housing, and water infrastructure. And so we're really grateful that you've joined us today. We will take some questions. Again, if you do have a question, please indicate in the chat your name and your outlet, and then Kelly will unmute you and call on you. But we do have a couple of questions that were submitted beforehand that I'll just take the time here to start off with. They come from Sarah Meerhoff, who is with Forum Communications. So the first question that Sarah has is, can you tell us about CGMC's top legislative priorities this year, which we did, and how do you see this divided legislature finding agreement on those issues? What is CGMC doing to work on both sides of the aisle to advance Greater Minnesota interests? And so to that, I would say, we are facing significant challenges legislating this year, right? We've got the only divided state legislature in the country. We are trying to legislate in a virtual and remote way during a pandemic. And we've had quite a bit of political upheaval here in our state and nation over the last several months. That said, I think that we should focus on some of the things that are positive that the legislature has been able to do, right? At the beginning of the pandemic, the legislature was able to come together and pass significant relief for Minnesotans. They've been able to distribute the CARES Act money. They've been able to provide another round of relief here in December with through legislation and state resources. And they were able to pass a significant, historically large bonding bill in October. And so I think those are some good foundations from which the state legislature can start as they do their work. In terms of how does CGMC play into that, all of our issues are very bread and butter issues. They're very core to providing good public services at an affordable price across the state. And that is not necessarily a controversial idea. And so we're hopeful that our issues are sort of in a sweet spot, that legislators can find common ground around them and finish up here in May. Sarah had one other question. What is the CGMC's take on the use of Minnesota's natural disaster funds to pay for rebuilding from this summer's civil unrest? And what are CGMC's views on a bill moving through committees that would declassify civil unrest as a natural disaster? If that bill were to pass, would CGMC be concerned for the financial stake of Greater Minnesota cities should they face civil unrest themselves in the future? So that's an excellent question, and I've got a couple of thoughts on it. I think 2020 and 2021 have forced us to consider and think about all sorts of things that we had never considered nor thought about before. It has certainly been, to use a very tired phrase, unprecedented. And so to be absolutely honest, we have not spent a lot of time necessarily as an organization talking about the issue of civil unrest and its connection to the natural disaster funds. The civil unrest that happened in Minneapolis and St. Paul in May and early June was certainly unprecedented. It was, at least in, once in my lifetime sort of thing for the state of Minnesota. And so I think that we have to figure out going forward, what is the state's role in dealing with those sort of things? And I think when you have these unprecedented, unique circumstances, the state does have some role in helping, and the size and scope of that, I think, is something that will need to be determined at the legislature. So those would be my thoughts on those issues. I'll turn it to Kelly to see if there are any questions that have come through from many of you that we can help address.
Yes, first up is Bill Warner from the Minnesota News Network. And Bill, remember to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I hope you folks can hear me. Thank you, Kelly, and appreciate you taking, if you don't mind, entertaining a couple of questions that are on somewhat diverse areas. The first is relative to Mr. Clark's comments on new home construction in Austin, which is a somewhat stunning number, I think. My question of you is, do we have a similar affordable housing situation? Does it extend to that area in your communities? If you don't mind, Mr. Clark, and also Mayor Zilka, if you can address that.
Sure.
Nick, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, great question, Bill. Yes, we do. We have needs at all levels of housing. Probably our chief one is on the senior housing front. From our housing study that we did, housing for seniors is a major concern, as well as the affordable side. We have advanced some affordable projects through Minnesota Housing Finance Agency. Some of the particulars that get really kind of interesting on what the rents they are that they pay there and how that relates to our median home value in the communities. There's some interesting story there. I won't delve down into that, but yes, we have needs at all levels. But when you look at greater Minnesota, I think the one thing that, you know, we see in the metro, we see high-rise apartments going forward and affordable units transitioning to market rate. In some respects, we'd only dream of seeing some of that in communities like Austin. We're just not producing the units on the top end. And to have a healthy housing continuum, you really need to have that moving forward. So you're producing housing stock to replace those. We deal with a lot of nuisance properties and have to take action to demolish some of those structures in Austin. So the 7 single family homes that we build in a year, you know, there might be 3 or 4 demolitions as well. So we're not even netting 7 homes a year. So the challenge is immense there. And like I mentioned earlier, this is all about our, you know, that's our tax base. When we operate local government, that's the tax base that we rely on to run our communities. I hope that answers your question.
Mayor Zilka, do you want to weigh in?
Yes, we are currently working with a developer, and we are also in need of senior care, our senior facility housing, and we're in need of market rate, and we are in need of affordable. And the developer we're working with right now, part of what we're developing is going to be some of the market rate and some of the affordable. So that was a requirement that we asked of them as they were doing this. And we're also looking at possibly tagging a daycare with that or childcare, because that's very important to our community also.
May I just ask generally, if you don't mind, and this may be a question for either of the gentlemen from the cities or from you, Bradley. What, if you can explain to a lay person, what could the legislature do, you know, number 1 or 2 things this session that might be politically doable, and we all know the environment here, to help kind of get things rolling in greater Minnesota on the housing issue?
Well, I think, you know, I can take a first start at that. You know, I think supporting, you know, the existing programs is very important. I think, you know, like I mentioned, one of the things that we're looking at is a new grant program to work on refurbishing and developing, redeveloping existing structures. And that's something that Craig talked about. You know, that is, I think, something that is pretty non-controversial. We're asking for $5 million on that front. It would help with what they call, you know, naturally occurring affordable housing in terms of getting those properties that already exist but need a little TLC going. That would be, I think, an easy thing that the state could do that would be small and would be a good start. I don't know, Craig or Mayor Zilka, if you've got other thoughts on what would be a good starter or politically viable from your perspective.
One of the pieces Bradley touched on is kind of the regulatory piece. I know we had a blighted house that we had here in town, and tax increment financing is our most flexible tool for a redevelopment housing tax district. But when you remove the blight, your ability to capture that largest and most beneficial tool really goes away. And what one of the items that we brought forward was having let us establish the increment that we're basing off of the house, document that, and then let us hold that value and capture the increment going forward. So it requires some flexibility on the TIF. Housing developments, as Mayor Zilka touched on as well, they take a lot of time and a lot of pieces to come together to make these projects go. The financial gap is immense, and it takes time to, one, bring a developer to the community that has interest, and then two, put together a package that can actually do that. And then when we find that our most advantageous tool has gone away, when we naturally want to try to eliminate blight in our community, it's not a very good message to our community to say, well, let's just board this up in the middle of town and let it sit there and rot until we can find a developer. That would be a tangible example, I think, of how we could ask for some flexibility on the regulations to make a difference in greater Minnesota.
I think the benefit of that too is that it would be no cost to the state. And so should be, something that I think folks could hopefully support.
Would you be, I don't know how many other folks are online, but will you entertain another question on the bonding bill specifically? And I'm wondering what kind of dollar amount you are thinking is necessary, and assess the political viability of that, given it appears that the Republican leadership in the Senate is perhaps willing to do a second bonding bill, but I think the number would be pretty small compared to last.
Yeah, sure. I'll take that quick, and then I do know we probably have other folks who have questions. So interestingly, we had a conversation just 2 days ago with a panel of legislative leaders. We had our kind of virtual legislative action day, and had over 170 people from around the state, on the Zoom at any given time. But the legislative leaders that we talked to, and so it was Representative Daudt, Senator Kent, Senator Jasinski, who's a assistant majority leader, and Representative Wolgamott, who's a assistant majority leader in the House. When we raised the issue of bonding bill, they were all very, very open to it and thought that it was something that was doable. The number that you're probably going to hear in terms of the total cost of the bill might be between $200 and $300 million, which would be in line with historically what we've typically done in off big bonding bill years. And so of that, we're asking for $100 million to begin or to continue the work done on the wastewater piece. I am hopeful that that's something that the legislature could get done here as they do all of their other work, and something that they definitely need to focus on, I think, to continue to make these quality investments in infrastructure that we need. Kelly, do we have other questions?
Yes. Next up is Matthew Leidke from the Bemidji Pioneer.
Good morning. My question, I actually have two. The first one is about water infrastructure. In Bemidji here, just recently we were awarded bond dollars for a new water treatment plant, but it's specifically for treating forever chemicals in the water. I'm curious if there are any other coalition cities that are dealing with this similar topic, that it's not just aging infrastructure, but there are these forever chemicals in local water supplies, and they're having to deal with that. And if so, what is kind of the coalition's stance on that? And then also a separate question is also if there is a federal stimulus package that comes out later this spring, what impact will that have on the legislative priorities?
Well, sure, Matt, I'm glad that you raised the Bemidji issue. So that is the issue with these per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS, the forever chemicals that I think are most notoriously linked with some of the issues 3M has been having in the East Metro. And it is true that Bemidji had to seek bonding dollars to basically re-drill their wells for their drinking water, because their wells were located near where their airport was, where there was significant testing and training with firefighting foam, of which contains a lot of these PFAS forever chemicals. So this is an issue that we're actually watching very closely. There are a number of proposals floating around the legislature to regulate these substances. They are incredibly difficult to deal with, especially in the wastewater context. And so one of the things that we are watching very carefully are any proposals that would hold cities liable or create regulations for cities in terms of taking it out of their waste streams. The problem is that right now, it just is not possible to take those things out of your wastewater streams and treat for at that level. And so we're obviously very wary of any proposal that would put regulations on cities that are just impossible to meet no matter how much money you spend. And so it is an issue that I think we're going to see pop up around the state in more and more different contexts. And then your other question about federal stimulus, we have been strong supporters of the notion that there need to be additional federal stimulus. The CARES Act money that came to the state and local governments, starting in March and that got distributed to cities and counties across the state in June and July, were critical in terms of helping cities not only with their own operations in dealing with the pandemic and adjusting all of the things that they need to do from, buying more vehicles so that they can spread their staff out, putting up plexiglass and service windows in City Hall, all of that sort of thing. But a lot of the money also got pushed out by cities and counties to businesses and residents in the form of, business grants, housing aid, all of that. And I think that it would be tremendously significant and very, very helpful if the federal government could get its act together and get more money in the direction of state and local governments, and flexible money as well. I think one of the things that we would say was a little bit problematic of some of the CARES Act money was a little bit too narrow in many ways for cities to use. And so I think that would be one issue to watch. The other thing I do want to mention is that whatever money would come, from a federal stimulus that would flow towards the city's directions cannot be mistaken as a substitute for local government aid. That is not an either or. It needs to be a this and. I don't know, Mayor Zilka or Craig, if you have any further thoughts on what a good federal stimulus could do.
The only comment I would make is I agree with you, Bradley. And what we did is gave a large share of ours to the businesses. And so if anything, as far as guidelines with percentages, I believe it was 10%, a minimum of 10% be spent on the businesses in the last one. And I wouldn't mind seeing that more, because I think the businesses are a large part of the survival of our community and what brings people to our communities. But I agree with you on the CARES Act dollars that there is a need for more.
Craig, anything else?
Yeah, I'd say, our communities are very resilient for the most part, but, we recently added a new grocery store in our community, and, the excitement around the grocery store in the metro, they just, there's another one to go to. Those, the mayor talked about there, the importance of our small business. We really, that's a tangible thing. Our first round of grants, we had up to $10,000. Our second wave that's coming through now, we're up to $25,000. And the demand for the second wave is going to be even larger than we saw for the first wave. And protecting our small businesses, I guess, is critically important. That flexibility piece that you mentioned, Bradley, is really key. Maybe in the Twin Cities, they decide to do a homeless shelter or something like that. That's not necessarily our need in a community like Austin. We have other things that we're trying to deal with. So having that flexibility to really tailor it to what we see outside our back door, helping our businesses and those that are struggling because of the pandemic, I think that's the key message we want to see going forward for those CARES dollars.
All right, Kelly, do we have more questions?
Yes, from Lori Sorensen at the Rock County Star Herald. She asks, how would the $20 million child care grant for construction work? It doesn't seem like it would go very far, considering so many communities are in the same boat. And to continue off of that, what would be considered greater Minnesota and who would be eligible?
Sure, well, let me take the second question first. We tend to define greater Minnesota as outside of the 7-county metro area. In terms of the how far the dollars can stretch, I think a couple of things. one of the things that, as we've done our research on some of these issues, and as you look at some of the needs around childcare and the costs related to starting a childcare facility, it can be expensive. I mean, we're talking, between $250,000 and $750,000 for the sort of typical startup costs for a facility. And so as you craft legislative proposals, right, you do so with both the need in mind, but then what also might be realistic. And so, the $20 million that we would be asking for would certainly not be the last amount that we would be asking for. But as you start new programs, you do want to have a little bit of proof of concept. And so our hope is that you could get the dollars out to folks, build beautiful, safe, great facilities for our youngest Minnesotans, and then point at that as a success, and then point at the next community that needs to replicate it. And so that's, I think, how it would sort of work. The money would flow through the local governments as sort of the kind of agent for it. But there's also some dollars that we're looking for that would be general fund dollars that could go more directly to nonprofits as well. So both through the local government and through local nonprofits that are doing that work would be our vision. Next question, Kelly.
Lori had a follow-up question. Lori, I see you're unmuted. Would you like to share with Bradley?
Hi, guys. We have identified this in Laverne and Rock County as our #1 economic issue, and probably a lot of communities have. And we've done a lot of work with, actually with Scott Marquardt and with other organizations about the fact that once you have a facility, it's great to have a facility, but the lower wages, especially in outstate Minnesota, don't support the professional salaries required to run an actual center. And that's where a lot of people get stalled on these projects. I mean, it's great to have a facility, but it will fail if there's not a long-term goal for supporting its operation, I guess. And I didn't know if, along with that bonding money, if there was anything else considered for long-term. I mean, you hate to invest in something that won't succeed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and the grants are certainly tied to feasibility of a project and that sort of thing. And you're right. One of the many challenges with childcare is the typically low wages that come with it, and the disconnect between what it takes and costs to run a facility and pay people to do it well, and then what parents and families can afford. And certainly there are a lot of folks who are working as well on the issue of affordability related to the Child Care Assistance Program, the CCAP program that provides resources to families. There's folks working on that front as well. I do think that there is an active discussion about what is the appropriate level of educational attainment for folks working in these facilities, questions about staffing. It is such a complicated and multifaceted and multi-angled problem that it really takes a 360 kind of look. And that's where we're working with organizations like the Initiative Foundations, and you mentioned Scott Marquardt's name. He's a tremendously passionate advocate on this issue, to look at those sort of system-wide questions and make sure that, the folks who are looking to start these projects and who are looking to step into the provider space have the training and the support and the understanding that they need to run it as a successful, either a successful nonprofit enterprise or a successful business enterprise.
I don't see any more questions in the chat.
All right, well, we'll give you all 1 or 2 more moments here to weigh in. Very good. Well, I do want to thank you for taking the time this morning. I want to thank Mayor Zelka and Craig Clark for being on with us and lending their expertise and their perspective. We very much value the work that all of you do to get news to your constituencies and cover what's going on here at the state capitol. And so do please, as you are encountering issues at the legislature, if you are ever interested in our perspective on things, don't hesitate to be in touch. We are always happy to field questions and provide perspective and insight. And with that, have a great rest of your day and a fabulous weekend. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.